Hello, this talk is Who is What or Who? Seeking the Subject in Photographic Theory. And my name is Ann Peglow-Kaplan. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies at Appalachian State University. In this talk, I wanted to give you a brief overview. First, I'll be doing some introductions. Who am I? Who's giving this talk, and what is my vested interest in this subject matter? Part 2, takeaways from the theoretical investigation of these two topic areas of the photograph and the portrait. And very specifically, what are ways in which these theoretical investigations do and do not interact and or overlap? I'll be kind of clustering or grouping these together to speak about them to you. And part 3, who is what or who? What or who does the intersection of the photograph and portrait tell us about? Basically, this is where I pull out some predominant themes in each of these topics, theoretical work, and very specifically look at how their interplay brings issues to light for us. And finally, conclusions and questions, and where do we go from here? So again, my name is Ann Peglow-Kaplan. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies at Appalachian State University. Appalachian State is in the far western, northwestern corner of North Carolina, which is a very long state. And our western part is quite mountainous. And we here at Appalachian State are basically perched on the Eastern Continental Divide. It's a beautiful area. And we are one of 16 campuses of the University of North Carolina system of higher education. And I invite you all to come visit our campus and see our beautiful mountain atmosphere. My training is in, as you heard, the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies is a great place because my training is very interdisciplinary. I work predominantly in visual culture, both as someone who does analysis specifically around photography and photographic technologies and photographic representation, and also as a creative practitioner. I am one of those odd birds that both does analysis and creative work, and they are very much intermingled in all my work. And in fact, if you're so fortunate as to be in Lisbon for this conference, I so wish that I could be. Please visit the exhibition. You'll see some of my work there as well, which is linked to this research. I am also an ABD PhD candidate at the European Graduate School in philosophy, and I work specifically around issues of philosophy, ethics, representation, and visual culture. And my background is also in ethnography and oral history. So it definitely weighs into this project as well as others. My current project is a book manuscript at sort of simultaneous to the dissertation. They're really one and the same. I know some people will be amused by that, but they really are. And I am in the process of completing the content sections of that work, and you see that very much reflected in this presentation. So part 2, theoretical takeaways, how major contributions do and do not interact concerning the subject. And by the subject, yes, of course, I mean the subject of the photograph, in the case of this slide, and the portrait in the next slide. But I also mean the subject with a capital S, which is in many ways what this work is about. How it is that the subject, which most people will use to refer to a human being, is in many ways determined by these forms of image making and image display. And you'll find over the course of the next few minutes that, of course, I'm not only speaking about human beings. There is certainly a strong line of posthumanism in this research and my work, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So I've organized this in 4 basic sections. Foundations. And I'm not going to actually go into these in a lot of detail because what's more important for me is the conclusions that I'm coming to, and I think those are going to be of most interest for you as well. But I've basically grouped these together in order to make my way through what, particularly in the case of the photograph, is a rich and dense and varied set of theoretical writings, which of course extends far, far beyond these, but I have tried to encapsulate those that I feel like are most influential in general and specifically towards the question of the subject, which is linked but not the same as the being represented in a portrait. So coming back to the slide for part A here, foundations, Bazin, Benjamin, Bordeaux, these are 3 writers and theorists coming from very different angles around the notion of the photograph, but lay foundations about, of course, some of the classic texts, mechanical reproduction, the representation of reality, and in Bordeaux's case, the kind of grounding of the photograph in a societal context, such as the family unit. Part B here, traces and windows, Barthes and Sontag being, along with Benjamin, perhaps the 2 most influential writers around the photograph. They're in varying ways entering into the notion of the photograph as traces of reality or windows into reality, whether we see the reality on the other side of the window or perhaps a reflection that we are somehow implicated in, more Sontag, the second part of that. Then critical responses, and you'll note that these are not exactly chronological, but there is a general chronological direction with these, with the main exception being Sontag, of course, whose work spans several decades. But then for critical responses, we have this whole list. I won't read the whole list here, but which encompass mainly critical theory, postmodern responses, with varying shades of difference, but basically concluding that the photograph is its own form of fiction, that it tells a story that often is in aid of various forms of power and privilege, whether by the state, whether by people of privileged identities, whether through capital. There are the approaches of this set mainly call into question someone like Barthes' tendency to see the photograph as a direct link to reality, and that a kind of visceral trace of reality remains in the photograph that in some ways touched what it represents. So the critical response theorists, of course, refute this directly and indirectly. Then we enter into this last set, which are in a way kind of a strange duo, but I think do work together for my purposes in that they look very much at what happens internally to the individual, whether Derrida's look at the individual interaction with the photograph as, again, a kind of fiction, but one that takes place largely inside of the individual viewer, or Kai Silverman taking a psychoanalytic approach with feminist groundings around how the photographic is consumed and how it sits within a larger scaffolding of privilege within the individual perspective. So I'm going to move on and not spend too long on these because I just want to give you a grounding of where these are coming from, and then I'll take us to our conclusions. So the second of these theoretical takeaways in part 3 here, again, how theoretical contributions do and do not interact concerning the subject, in this section regarding the portrait. Now, this will come out in the next slide, but part of the reason this list is so much shorter is that, of course, the portrait in terms of photographic portrait, but also the historic lineage of the photographic portrait in drawing, painting, printmaking, etc., is a much, it's a much shorter affair. Very few people who are actually working in theory have addressed this topic. And it is one that I think is very ripe for continued ongoing research. It is very much understudied from a theoretical perspective. And I'll get to that some more in the next section. But for here, what we find, I only have one name really for foundations from a theoretical perspective, which is Richard Brilliant. His work on portraiture, which grounds it largely from an almost pre-visual culture, therefore art history perspective. But definitely he goes into both the art historical conventions around what quote unquote counts as a portrait, but then really takes the reader further into a theoretical exploration of, what is the relationship of the portrait to the real subject, the real person. And Brilliant does say it must be a person, although sometimes contradicts himself about that. Then we have back to Derrida, who here I have listed a second time for portraiture. And I'm glad to provide a short bibliography for anyone interested. Please feel free to get in touch with me about that at a later time. But for Derrida, very much a substitution that we may be looking at a portrait of one person, but is that actually who is being represented and who we are viewing, right? Who we are consuming. And Derrida, of course, says, no, in fact, not. Costello revisits Benjamin's aura and problematizes it further, and in fact says that it has been largely misinterpreted, and that in fact we could take a look at the way Benjamin describes aura and says that there is the possibility of aura in some cases, and it largely arrives at the notion of the portrait, the face, and particularly the gaze and the look, the potential for meeting of eyes, so to speak. So very important to this consideration of how we might actually interact with the subject in the portrait. So moving on, these two folks, Didi Huberman and Nancy, the philosophical great who has recently passed, rest in peace, address in many ways how the portrait is less the representation of one or more persons, but rather is a relation between the viewer and something else. For Didi Huberman, it's more linked to historical realities. This is in part Didi Huberman's focus on portraiture as discussed in photographs from the Holocaust, from extermination camps from the Holocaust. And so it's much more rooted in a kind of trace of reality. In Nancy's case, it's very much the relation of the viewer to the image of a person in the portrait, rather than the physically manifested person whose likeness may be portrayed in the portrait. So, but in both cases, it's very much a relation, very much an activity, an event, as much or more so than an object. And finally, I wanted to list this last set, and very importantly, including Deborah Willis, in terms of the historical realities of the portrait, that in fact, we can have many decades of theoretical writings around what a portrait accomplishes, but unless we look with specificity at the lives and individuals impacted, in Deborah Willis's case, in terms of Black individuals whose subjectivity is being attempted to be represented, or in many ways not attempted to be represented, that we absolutely have the necessity of including those historical realities as a part of our theoretical focus. So in all, these offer, though it's a short number of works and theorists, they offer a very important variety of perspectives on this topic, which you'll see integrated in a moment. So when I asked the question, the rather confusing question, who is what or who, that's in many ways a conclusion that I've come to from this kind of long journey of reading this century of theory around the photograph and the portrait, with the question of the representation of subjectivity or not, or the not the representation of subjectivity within photographic portraiture. So what do the interactions of this over century of theory tell us about these subjects, these topics, and about the notion of the subject, of the appearance of subjectivity? Let's look at some conclusions first from these range of works, and also how they combine. So point A, while theorists have continued to focus on the photograph, they have for the most part overlooked the portrait. And this of course gets more complex as we go down this slide. But basically, there is just an overwhelming wealth of writing around the photograph, the definition of the photograph, the investigation, the excavation of what the photograph is, how it works, what it accomplishes, and debate over this. But there's so little work on the portrait. It is staggering in the contemporary era, where we largely communicate through images of people on social media, that in fact the portrait as a form is still being, for the most part, ignored. So point B, Theorists continue to debate the long-standing question of the photograph's trace, right? Its trace, its physically manifested touch of reality, rather than the individual and societal implications of this question. So we still can read papers up to this point where theorists say, is the photograph real? Does it represent reality? Does it show reality? Is there something special about the photograph in that it, whether analog or digital, although of course most would point to analog photography, but digital as well is implicated, by having an actual touch to the scene, the physical scene in reality that it purports to represent. This debate is still captures the attention and airspace around the photograph, rather than questions of, okay, if most of society, though it knows the possibility for photoshopping and the rest, Instagram filters, what have you, nonetheless interacts with the photograph as if it is a representation of reality, as if it does have some kind of trace to the real. What are the implications of that kind of interaction? What does that accomplish? Point C, theoretical investigators refer to their own studies as considerations of photography as a whole, the photograph, all of photography, when the vast majority actually address images of and about human beings, portraiture writ large, which I'll address on the next slide. So what most theorists tend to do is say, well, let's talk about photography. We're going to talk about photography now. What is a photograph? How does photography work? What is its impacts? When 98% of writings actually are dealing with human-centric images. So we're not talking about photography. We're talking about photography around and about humans. These are very different issues. So continued, point D. Theorists outline that the public and sometimes or often academic conception of a portrait is far more limited than what actual still and moving images function as in terms of contemporary portraiture. So to break that down, if we read theoretical writings, those addressed earlier and others, that outline what a portrait is, what we find is that a portrait actually is not just a framed photograph or painting of a person's face, head, and upper torso. That a portrait can be far more than this. There is a portraiture writ large. There is, and it is frankly staggering. It is a kind of sublime in its breadth and depth and sheer number, especially in our contemporary internet-based and cell phone-based era. So we'll go on to the question about that in our next section. But basically, our public and even academic conception of the portrait is just the tip of the iceberg. Point E, whether or not photographs and portraits image the real, the who and or what of their visual content points, let me start that again. Whether or not photographs and portraits image the real, the who or what their visual content points to is not that physical subject whose likeness is in the image. So what does that mean? Okay, let's break this down. If a photograph or a portrait has its the surface of its image showing a real life subject. The likeness of the real life subject is put in that image, that photograph or portrait. But what theorists basically agree on over the last many decades is that that likeness is something completely different than the physical being, person, animal, what have you, who is being portrayed. When we interact with a photograph or a portrait, we're interacting with a likeness. That may seem obvious, but in fact, it really isn't. Point F, the last one for this section. Pardon me. Although the physical subject is not who or what is imaged in a photograph or portrait, that physical subject in reality, the real physical subject, is both directly and indirectly impacted by the image. This is one of the main points of Nuncy's work on the portrait, which I cannot recommend highly enough to you if you're interested in this subject matter. So these have led me to my set of research questions, which is what I am finishing up a draft of my manuscript on now, which are these, along with a few others. What are the functions of the public, often academic, and contemporary art-based definitions of the portrait? So this is a function-based analysis. How does the portrait actually operate? That is part of my question. How does the photographic portrait operate? What does it do? Not just what it displays. What it displays is certainly part of it. But then what does it do? This type of analysis allows for an object to potentially have agency, so that an object may be an actor in the world. And so the portrait is being cast in that light here. Question 2. What does it mean to tacitly equate photographic and portrait-based representation with that of humans? I'll say that again. What does it mean to equate the photograph and portrait-based representation with those kinds of representations of humans? And what are the individual and societal impacts of this assumption? If we say photography, and what we're really talking about is photography of and around humanity, what does that mean and what does that accomplish? Similarly for the portrait. If a portrait, by definition, is a portrait of a human, what does that mean and what does that accomplish? Question 3. What does the notion of photographic reality accomplish in the contemporary era? Right, photographic reality. And specifically, how does it relate to the societal impact of portraits writ large? So if the photograph, even if in an era when we absolutely know that Photoshop is very real, people are changing their avatars from minute to minute. Pardon me. And yet we interact, it's very well documented that we still interact with photographs as a sign of the real. So what does that mean? What does that mean now? And point 4, and this is absolutely key, how do these questions intersect with contemporary realities of difference? Race, gender and sexuality, nationality, ability, and others. Those as contemporary realities, the surveillance state as a form of contemporary reality, and some people would say surveillance capitalism, and climate change, and mass extinction events that go with climate change. If we define the photograph, and if we define the portrait, and if we define the photographic portrait as basically representations of humans, what does that mean? How does that intersect with the historical definition of a human in our shared global history of colonialism, the enslavement of various peoples, genocides? How do our definitions of human and humanity affect that portraits are considered to be images of a human? If we believe that, or rather, if we interact with photographs as traces and evidence of reality, what does that mean about our interaction with cameras on police cars, at stoplights, on street corners, and in buildings? What are the functions of those kinds of portraits? And in a world where we are increasingly have the imperative to consider post-humanist perspectives in terms of the planet we live on and beyond, life that is being forever impacted by the Anthropocene, and mass extinction events, which are caused by human interactions with the environment. What does it mean if a portrait is defined to be of a human? And how do these forms resonate and potentially change with our contemporary realities? So those are my research questions currently from this topic and my current project. My name is Ann Peglow Kaplan. I want to thank you again. I really do welcome your questions. I so am missing live conferences and the dialogue and exchange of ideas. So I just invite you to get in touch with me and want to thank you.